the next conversation, which is around sort of PR expanding its options with media using data. So the conversation that we're about to have is around media innovation. And, as we all know, the pandemic, we've seen this sort of continued and devastating contraction of media, but there's also been some bright spots. I think there's a lot of promise in a new model that's emerging with journalists kind of flocking to things like Substack and innovations like that. And on the product side, we've seen an expansion of opportunities as well. I think as one example, earlier this year, Quartz named Daniel Alvarez as Chief Product Officer, and he's now overseeing editorial product innovation, engineering, design, product management, analytics. Did I miss anything, Daniel?
You got it.
I got it. Well, welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have this conversation. As one chief product officer to another, it's interesting how sort of we come at this from very different perspectives. So I'm a journalist, right, by training, but your background is in data. So tell me a little bit about this.
So, well, my background is actually in engineering, and my early career, I started through the engineering ranks, quickly pivoting to product management. And one of the advantages of this for me, one of the things I got out of it, product management in tech companies is a really well-established practice. Well, I think in media, it's still considered nascent. You find some media companies that don't really know what product management is or how to approach it. So I think that structured approach to product management, and then fast forward now, me being in media, has really helped me sort of shape, not only from a processes perspective, but from a strategy perspective on how to approach building products, how to make sure that we enable technologies that are going to really be the engine of innovation in the future, and that the customer centricity is not just something nice that people say. Like, I've seen the impact of how being customer obsessed really translates to the bottom line.
Right. And I think, as part of that, you and I have talked about, so you have a very specific strategy around data that you're bringing to Quartz. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's all centered around our first party data. And we strive to create a meaningful value exchange for our readers between what we ask of them and what they get in return. Like sometimes you might see other companies where they just ask information from users and users are not directly getting anything. We try to strike that balance. Like if we are asking for information such as job title, what place you work, that translate into better experiences for them on our site or for things that we might build in the future.
Well, that might be a good place to pause and sort of talk a little bit about. So who do you consider to be Quartz's, what's your readership profile?
Right. So we like to refer to them as a new era of purpose-driven leaders. We've seen that there are a group of people that want to affect change in the world. They tend to be mission-driven. They're interested in areas such as climate action, social inclusion, among others. And that translates into having, at least among our competitors, we rank #1 for C-suite level executives, people that have influence in organizations. They're affluent readers that earn more than $250,000 per year. So it's a pretty attractive group of folks that, at least from a client perspective, and a super interesting audience to serve.
Right. So, at this moment, PR agencies sort of have this like surplus of budget for their clients. And, with earned media options sort of narrowing, I've talked to so many agency leaders who are sort of encouraging their clients to sort of allocate some of that money towards paid options, with media entities like Quartz. But from what I hear from the agencies, this is still an uphill battle, sort of convincing folks to apply some of this budget towards, things like sponsored content. So when it comes to Quartz Creative, which is your brand storytelling division, who are your clients? Are they mostly coming from the advertising side, or are you increasingly seeing interest from the PR side?
They're mostly coming from the advertising side. They're predominantly enterprise technology. We have some consulting firms, finance, luxury autos. Anecdotally, though, we have seen a small uptick of PR-driven campaigns, but it's still a small portion of our overall base.
What do you think? I mean, are you all doing any education at Quartz to try to sort of expand that base a bit? Because the money is there.
Nothing specific, but our business team and our creative team, they're always sort of in the look for any new interesting clients that might want to put their message in Quartz. So we're always open for new opportunities.
So, when I was thinking about this, I looked at sort of, brand content is obviously an obvious place, but another area that sort of jumped out at me was you all have this something called obsessions, right? Which is sort of a new way to sort of organize newsrooms, sort of in lieu of sort of the traditional beat model, right? And it provides sort of advertisers a way to have, I think, contextually relevant sort of editorial alignments. That to me seems like such a natural place for PR. Can you talk a little bit about what Obsessions is, and where the opportunity is for brands?
Yeah, for sure. So our obsessions are what we see as major trends happening in business. And that's how we like to sort of cover the creation of our content, is really looking forward into the future, into what things are going to be having an impact into our daily lives. So we have things like fixing capitalism, future of work, rethinking cities. And some of those future trends that we see, depending on our vertical, we translate them, for example, for Quartz of Work into management advice. So it's all really trying to be very future looking. And we find that some of these obsessions sort of create a natural alignment with some of the clients that want to advertise with us. They are revised, but this is not something that changes periodically. Like the editorial team, they define those, and then they really build upon them over time. It's not something that's just changed frequently.
Okay, so the editorial team sort of decides what those narratives will be, and
Correct.
then the advertisers can come in and form alignments accordingly. You mentioned some really big topics here, right? Like fixing capitalism, the future of work, rethinking cities. So are you seeing any trends in terms of what people, like what advertisers or even what your audience is being drawn to, and how much does that sort of ebb and flow? Or are you seeing any consistencies around the topics and themes that are really resonating?
I think it's really spread out. I think all of our obsessions do get some interesting traction with our readers, and I think we see a whole range of some of the clients, depending on what aligns with them, the obsessions that they decide sort of to put their content against. For when it comes to what we see as interesting topics that drive conversion to our membership business, there we tend to see tech consumer trends are typically something that resonates very well for people that make the leap to membership. We had a great series about NFTs, the metaverse. Work advice for Quartz at Work is always something that resonates pretty well. And then some of the explanatory coverage of macro trends, like we have a long-standing coverage of COVID, of course, and what are the ripple effects that it has throughout all different facets of the economy.
I think it's interesting that these sort of bigger, ambitious questions, right, around fixing capitalism and climate change aren't necessarily what converts folks into becoming members. It's more sort of what applies to their day-to-day lives, like you said, tech consumer trends, NFTs, work advice, the metaverse, which tracks with what we've been hearing all day, honestly, around this idea. I mean, not apples for apples, but this idea that you have to make messaging local and sort of micro targeted for it to prompt behavior change. And it sounds like that's true for media conversions as well. I don't know that you can give me specific numbers, but I'm curious around what conversion rates are. Just thinking about the media model, I don't know if I was reading about, Casey Newton on Substack was saying that he expected a 10% conversion rate, and he only got about 5%. And I'm just wondering sort of what expectations are around conversion and what the reality is.
So those numbers I don't have the top of mind to share, but I can tell you that it's an area that we are constantly experimenting with and just finding what's the right type of content that converts better. Something that we're doing behind the scenes on the engineering front, we are revamping our payment and subscriptions platform with the hopes that that's going to allow us to do even more experimentation and sort of draw different types of users towards different type of content, and then evaluating, does that improve the funnel overall as we're trying to strive for higher conversion rates.
Right. And so so I guess, so another piece of that with the payment sort of process, what about privacy? Sort of how's privacy factoring into your product development? And because, you know, there's not consistent rules across different geographies. So how do you factor that?
So everything we build, we make sure is compliance, of course, with GDPR and CCPA. And then on top of that, every time we ask for information from our readers, we make sure that it's done with their consent. And that's something that we're going to be collecting behind the scenes, but we're very explicit about the things that we ask of them, whether it's something that we might request on the onboarding process, or sometimes we engage with our readers through surveys and studies. Like all that is really done with their consent, that we make sure then that on the back end, all the data is handled in a secure way, that including our process of data governance, to make sure that everything is safe, secure, and private for our readers.
Right. And so I want to go back to what you were saying earlier about, you know, so for example, with Obsessions, right, that, you know, that's all editorially driven. Do you find any challenges? This is going to be a multi-part question, so I'm going to start with part one, which is, do you find it hard to align between sort of what your readers want and what your advertisers want? And well, yeah, let's start there. I mean, is that something that you have to? Is that something that keeps you up at night?
I don't know. It doesn't keep me up at night. That's more towards the between the editorial team and our creative studio team. So they're the ones that are really battling with those questions every day. But specifically speaking about our creative team, they are experts about finding those alignments. Like, so one of the things that they're very, very good at, and when they're creating this specific campaigns for a client, like they look for that overlap between what we know our readers want and the type of message that a client wants to deliver. And I think them working side by side with the client really are expert about finding those alignments and making sure that there's brand sort of relation between everything that they do.
Do you I'm sorry, this might be a better question for your brand creative team, but you know, I'm curious sort of how much education has to go into this. You know, how much do the advertisers come to you and say, you know, these are our message points, and how much do you have to say, yes, that's great, but this is just not what our audience is going to care about. We need to refine this. And how, like, what is that process like, and how time intensive is it? And, you know, because I know even just from the PR side, right? I mean, that just, you know, journalists having to go back to PR folks and saying, okay, yeah, thanks for pitching me this story. The only thing my readers are going to care about is this one little piece of it. So if we want to move forward, we're going to have to focus on that. Like, I wonder what that process is like. And are there any parameters you all put up front to sort of help ease that and make it, you know, so that everyone's going in sort of with their eyes wide open?
Right. Yeah, definitely a better question for our creative studio team. But one of the things I do know that we have repeat clients that they already know what to expect when they come to Quartz and advertise. So I think part of that education is not so intensive, since we do have some clients that are coming back to advertise with us multiple times. But I think the type of clients that typically come for Quartz are naturally aligned with some of the things that we strive to have as a brand. So if I had to guess, I don't want to speak for my partners in creative studios. I don't think the education is probably that intensive, but something I can definitely follow up with them and sort of give you back some more information.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just that. Well, so I mean, that's just a challenge that, you know, this tension that sort of exists always, right, between any sort of editorial content and sort of public relations. You know, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of your previous role as well. So you came from NBC Universal, where you were VP of Product and Design for NBC and the Telemundo TV stations. Can you talk a little bit about some of the learnings from there, and especially, talking to a diverse audience and how you're applying that mindset at Quartz.
Sure. So NBC was a very interesting experience. Over there, I was overseeing product and design for a large group. It was mostly local TV stations, both English and Spanish speaking languages. So one of the main challenges you have there is with one centralized product team, how do you serve the needs of so many different clients? And by clients of the central product team, I mean the TV stations, and still being true to their local audience. So one of the things I learned from that, which I am now applying to all of my product thinking, is how to distill the needs of the different local stations. Even though they're very different, there's so many commonalities across them. So making sure that you can create an abstraction of who the local viewer in this case was, and how can we create products that are not only solving the problem for that one particular TV station, but across many different TV stations throughout the country. And on top of that, the challenge of having them speak different languages, is making sure that we also keep in mind that the differences between serving news for Spanish-speaking audiences versus English-speaking audiences.
Right. Yeah. Which I mean, that's blurring more and more, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you also about sort of blinders and transparency around sort of brand content, right? There was a moment where everybody was into banners, and then we all got our banner blinders, and we just don't see those advertisements anymore, right? So now we're kind of moving into sort of more native advertising, where the advertisements look more like the rest of the content. Do you feel like there are some amount of blinders that people are put on, especially once they see tags that are sponsored by or in partnership with, and what do you do to get around that? Well, I guess let's start there.
So, well, first we do start by being very transparent, and all the right sponsor markings are in the right places to make sure that users are able to see them. So one of the things that we found is that as long as it's a interesting and a great piece of content, we can get the same or similar level of engagement, even if they have the sponsor markings to them. So I think it all boils down to having great content. It doesn't matter if it's editorial content, if it's something that is sponsored content, if it's great quality, if it's providing users with value, like they're getting something in return from spending the time of reading that piece, is looking over that chart. I think that's what's ultimately gonna make users really want to continue engaging with it.
The universal rule for all content, right? Make it engaging, and make it add value to people's lives, and they will pay attention whether it's sponsored or not. On that note, is there anything, and I know you've only been at Quartz for since April, but is there anything that you've seen that's worked especially well, that that anyone listening today could think about when they're developing their own content strategy? In terms of, are people leaning more towards audio right now? Like, there was this who doesn't have a podcast these days, right? Podcast, was it video? Is it visually, visual graphics or interactive graphics? Just curious if you're seeing any trends in this moment in terms of what's working, long form versus short digestible content.
So one of the things we really strive to do is provide people with deep analysis, but deep analysis doesn't necessarily mean long. One of the latest products that we launched is called Quartz Essentials. It's trying to solve for that. We're giving you deep analysis on a particular trend, but we're doing it in a very short form, snackable way. The Essentials, they come in two versions. One of them is like a stack of cards that you can easily swipe between them, and each card gives you a nugget of information that is really valuable on its own. So giving readers the ability to just spend only a few minutes instead of 20, 30 minutes reading some content, and they're able to walk away with valuable information. That's something that we've seen pretty good interest with. And we also have a podcast. Like you said, everyone has podcasts. It's called the Quartz Obsession. Just a nice plug there. If you guys are interested, go check it out. But it's fairly new. Like we just launched it. It's still too new to kind of determine where it's going, but so far we've seen some interesting engagement from it as well.
You know, I really liked your point that, you know, deep analysis doesn't have to mean long, which I think for especially like old school journalists, right, like myself, like that's sort of what we sort of grew up around. And I think it has been a mindset shift to think about things differently. And that's part of the value, right, of knowing your reader. If you know your reader is highly educated or, you know, knows a lot about X, Y issue, you don't need to spend a lot of that. You don't need all that exposition, right, to set everything up. You can get straight to the heart of the matter, and that can kind of keep things more interesting for folks. They don't have to wade through all of the backstory that they may already know. We've thought about that a lot with our readers as well. All right, so we have about like 30 seconds. So do you want to just tell me what you're most excited about that you're working on?
It's about our data strategy. Like that's one of the main things I'm focused on right now. We spent most of this year laying the foundation of it from an architectural perspective, and now we're starting to see the fruits of it. So next year is really going to be everything that our first party data strategy is going to enable us to do.
Yep. All right, well, Daniel, this was a great sort of informative discussion. I find media obviously to be really interesting. So I'm curious to see how your role evolves and sort of what you do next at Quartz.
Thank you. No, this was great. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.